Malaysia and Indonesia once engaged in a major war against each other, lasting over 3 years. Hundreds of soldiers from both sides lost their lives. More importantly, this conflict involved a confrontation between the legendary British SAS Special Forces and Indonesia's elite, Kopassus Special Forces. Today, we will explore the story of the confrontation, or Konfrontasi, an undeclared war between Indonesia and Malaysia. This dates back over 60 years ago. After the mainland region of Malaysia, on the Malay Peninsula, gained independence from Britain in 1957, East Malaysia, located on the island of Borneo, had not yet achieved independence. At that time, Borneo was divided into 2 parts. The western part was a British colony, while the eastern part belonged to Indonesia, which had been fully independent nearly 10 years before Malaysia. The part of Borneo that was a British colony is called East Malaysia, which consists of 2 states, Sarawak, with a population of about 900,000, and Sabah, with a population of about 600,000. Within Sarawak was the small British colony of Brunei, with approximately 80,000 inhabitants. Brunei would later gain full independence as Brunei Darussalam. The Indonesian part of Borneo is called Kalimantan, covering the majority of the island, including North, East, West, Central, and South Kalimantan provinces. Simply put, the island of Borneo was split into 2 territories under 2 different countries, the British colony and Indonesia. A confrontation was therefore inevitable. The island of Borneo was covered with dense rainforests, so much so that legends of cannibals were told there. Roads on the island of Borneo are limited, making travel and transportation full of various obstacles. However, Borneo had several large rivers that served as main transportation routes. When Malaysia on the Malay Peninsula gained independence from Britain, Britain planned to transfer its Bornean colonies, Sabah and Sarawak, to be merged under Malaysia. At the same time, Indonesia, under President Sukarno, saw an opportunity to seize the remaining territories of Borneo, particularly the southern region of Sabah, which had a significant Indonesian population. Indonesia thus planned to deploy military forces to seize the entire territory, similar to their actions in Dutch New Guinea. This resulted in Indonesia taking control of Irian Jaya and western Papua, which continues to this day. Then in 1962, fighting broke out between Malaysia and Indonesia over the Sarawak and Sabah territories. Both Malaysia and Indonesia called this event the confrontation, or Konfrontasi in English. It means a confrontation, essentially an undeclared war between Malaysia and Indonesia. Meanwhile, certain politicians in Brunei did not wish to be merged with Malaysia as Britain had planned. They preferred to align with Indonesia and thus supported the Indonesian military. Therefore, the North Kalimantan National Army of Indonesia supported its allied politicians in Brunei to seize power thereon. December 8, 1962, they deployed troops to aid the rebels in seizing the Sultan's palace, taking over oil facilities, and holding Westerners hostage. Initially, Indonesian forces used local Kalimantan volunteers trained by the Indonesian military. These local forces were well acquainted with Borneo's dense jungle terrain. They could infiltrate Brunei and parts of Malaysia without detection. Over time, seeing their advantage, Indonesia reinforced the main army to continue their offensive. They managed to advance steadily. The British forces stationed in the colony of Singapore. They responded by sending the famous Gurkha soldiers to recapture Brunei from the rebels and encircle the Indonesian troops, preventing them from retreating back into North Kalimantan. In the end, the troops and equipment of Indonesia's North Kalimantan National Army were forced to surrender. In April 1963, Indonesian troops launched an attack on the police station in Tebedu, Sarawak. The British responded by deploying troops to the area, along with 105mm artillery. However, the dense jungle terrain made it nearly impossible to spot the enemy, even at close range, hindering artillery use. Because the forward observer, or artillery spotter, was unable to observe the point of impact or the target. Thus, the fighting was mostly close quarters, involving small units at the platoon and company levels. When artillery support proved ineffective, the British adapted by placing one artillery gun directly at the infantry base. Instead of establishing a separate firing base, the artillery positioned within the infantry base was used to provide covering fire by randomly spraying shells in the direction of the enemy's assault. Meanwhile, Malaysia, now independent, deployed personnel from the 3rd Battalion, Malay Regiment, to Tawa and Sabah. The 1st Battalion operated in Sarawak. On the 27th of July, 1963, Indonesian President Sukarno declared he would crush the Malaysian forces. He justified this by claiming Malaysia was a puppet of Britain. This expansion into Kalimantan would increase British influence over Borneo and directly affect Indonesia's security. Just as the Philippines disputed Malaysia's claim over the territory of Sabah, arguing that Sabah was historically an important area for the Philippines, particularly as the land of the Sultan of Sulu. This dispute eventually led to clashes between Malaysian soldiers and the armed forces of the Sulu in early 2013. Despite efforts by Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines to negotiate a joint resolution during that period, they agreed that a referendum would be held for the local population to decide which country to belong to. However, the referendum was delayed, prompting Sarawak and Sabah to take matters into their own hands and declare independence during Malaysia's Independence Day celebrations on August 31st, 1963. And once both states had gained independence, they declared their intention to join Malaysia, which Malaysia did not refuse. Agreeing to incorporate Sarawak and Sabah into a single country, these developments caused significant dissatisfaction in Indonesia. As Indonesia viewed the events as a breach of the agreed-upon terms and an action backed by the British, aimed at expanding British imperial influence over the island of Borneo. The confrontation between Malaysia, supported by Britain, and Indonesia continued relentlessly. In December 1963, the Malaysian soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, stationed in Tawa, had to confront the commando unit, known as the KKO, short for Korps Komando Operasi, which is an elite combat unit of the Indonesian Marines that had previously carried out operations in Irian Jaya, a former colonial territory of the Netherlands. 35 Indonesian commandos, along with 128 volunteers, crossed the border into Malaysian territory. They hid in a large marsh for 8 days, undetected by Malaysian forces. They then launched a nighttime attack on the 3rd Battalion base, which had about 50 soldiers. The fighting was swift and intense, resulting in 8 Malaysian soldiers killed and 19 wounded. This marked another success for the Indonesian Special Forces in this battle. With the situation turning disadvantageous, Britain sent Gurkha troops to engage the Indonesians. The fighting between the Gurkhas and Indonesian Special Forces lasted over a month. 2/3 of the Indonesian commandos were killed, wounded, or captured. This operation not only failed, but was also disavowed by President Sukarno. By accusing those commando soldiers of acting independently, having no connection whatsoever with the Indonesian military, he insisted that he still sought peace and called for a ceasefire. However, Sukarno simultaneously ordered additional military reinforcements. For example, sending Indonesian commando units into Sabah, elevating their presence to a full battalion-level force. They also deployed BTR-50 armored personnel carriers, PT-76 light tanks, BRDM-2 reconnaissance vehicles, 122mm field artillery for support. 3 battalion-sized units were sent to confront forces along the Sarawak border. In addition, Indonesia also deployed the Special Forces Unit Kopassus, or Komando Pasukan, KUSUS, which is Indonesia's elite Special Forces unit. At that time, Kopassus operated under the name APAD, or RPKAD was deployed on a rotational basis to launch attacks against the state of Sarawak, particularly targeting Kuching, the capital city of Sarawak. At the same time, Australia and New Zealand also sent troops to support the British forces, whose main strength consisted of the Gurkha regiments and the Malaysian army, causing the conflict to escalate and drag on. In June 1964, Britain, along with Australian and New Zealand troops, launched Operation Charette. This operation continued for 2 years, lasting until 1966. Operation Charette involved the use of small military units, or special forces, which included the British SAS units. The SAS units of Australia and the SAS units of New Zealand, along with regular infantry units, carried out continuous cross-border infiltration operations to attack Indonesian soldiers within Indonesia. They also gathered intelligence on Indonesian troop movements and activities through separate channels. Initially, infiltration into Indonesian territory was limited to about 3 kilometers, later expanding to 6 kilometers, and eventually 10 kilometers. During British incursions into Indonesia, Indonesia responded with full-scale offensives. This resulted in multiple clashes between British and Indonesian special forces. The fighting was evenly matched. Because the Indonesian special forces were highly familiar with the dense tropical rainforest terrain. This posed an obstacle to the combat operations of Western foreign soldiers. Finally, the largest battle of the Malaysia-Indonesia conflict broke out at Pelabuhan Mapu on the 27th of April 1965. It involved a major Indonesian assault into Malaysian territory near the small village of Pelabuhan Mapu, which extended about half a mile into the territory of Sarawak State, serving as the base of B Company, belonging to the British Parachute Regiment, consisting of 30 soldiers, equipped with 2 3-inch mortars as supporting weapons. The battle began when approximately 400 Indonesian soldiers, supported by artillery and rocket launchers, they advanced to attack the British soldiers operating the mortar guns, and they were able to destroy one of the mortar launchers. At the same time, Indonesian artillery also shelled the British stronghold. This caused the British forces to suffer casualties and fall into a state of confusion. But shortly afterward, the British paratrooper unit regained its footing. At the same time, they regrouped and recaptured the mortar base from the Indonesian forces. They were hit by a heavy barrage of Indonesian artillery fire, resulting in more than half of them being wounded. However, the British paratroopers continued to advance and engage the Indonesian soldiers in combat. The battle raged fiercely, escalating to close-quarters combat. At least 30 Indonesian soldiers managed to infiltrate the British troops' base. Even though the British forces held their ground and used heavy machine guns to suppress the Indonesian advance, meanwhile, the nearby British artillery base also acquired targeting range, and they proceeded to bombard the Indonesian soldiers with 105mm artillery and mortar. The battle continued for over an hour and a half. Indonesian soldiers continued to launch successive waves of attacks. The first wave, the second wave, and the third wave, which was the final one. Meanwhile, the British forces responded with artillery fire, causing the Indonesian forces to suffer losses and ultimately retreat. This battle was a confrontation between elite British paratrooper units and Indonesia's special forces. The fighting resulted in the deaths of 2 British soldiers and injuries to 8 others. The casualty figures for the Indonesian side were not disclosed. In this battle, Indonesia considered itself victorious, or at the very least, capable of holding its ground against the elite British paratrooper units. However, this battle became the last major confrontation between Malaysia and Indonesia. From that point onward, Indonesian forces never again entered Malaysian territory or attacked the British forces. It was not until 1966, when President Suharto assumed office, replacing President Sukarno, Indonesia's territorial claims over Sarawak and Sabah came to an end. Peace negotiations began in May 1966, and a ceasefire agreement was signed on August 11th of the same year. The outcome of the confrontation war: both the British and Malaysian forces suffered 114 fatalities, 181 wounded, and 10 captured as prisoners of war. The Indonesian forces suffered 590 killed, 222 wounded, and 771 captured as prisoners of war, while 36 civilians in the area were killed and another 53 were injured. Just 1 year after the confrontation between Malaysia and Indonesia ended, Malaysia then faced a new threat from the Malaysian Communist Party, which resumed attacks on the country in 1967. This resulted in prolonged fighting along the northern border of the country adjoining Thailand, lasting for 22 years. The fighting finally ceased in December 1989. This was due to Thailand's role as a mediator facilitating the negotiations.